match that effort, and we will want to examine this aspect in our hearing this afternoon. So can I welcome on the committee's behalf, in no particular order, David Hill, the Director General of Rural and Marine at DEFRA. Welcome on the left. David was appointed Director General of Environment, Rural and Marine in October 22. He was previously Interim Director General Environment, Rural and Marine from December 2019 to October 20, and before that he was Director of Environmental Quality at DEFRA, so he is well seized of this issue. May I also welcome in the centre Gareth Davies, CB, Second Permanent Secretary of DFT. Gareth has been Second Permanent Secretary of the Department of Transport since January 2022. And his responsibilities include decarbonisation targets for transport technology and international and security. And finally, but by no means least, Nick Harris, have you been before the committee before? I was trying to remember.
I haven't. This
since
is
you
the
were appointed.
First time.
No, well, you are very welcome. I'm sure we will see you again. You are the Chief Executive of the National Highways. Nick, you was appointed as Acting Chief Executive of Highways England in February 21 and was appointed to the role permanently in August 2021 when the organisation was renamed as National Highways, and you joined the organisation as Executive Director of Operations in September 2016, so you've been part of the organisation for a long time. So welcome to all of you. You'll be glad to know that we don't have any subjects at the top, so we will go straight into the subject. I should explain before we start that our chair, Meg Hillier, is sadly at a funeral today, so that is why I, as Deputy Chair, will be taking the chair this afternoon. And just for the record, I should record that Tamara Finkelstein, as the Second Permanent Secretary, David Hill, has made clear, has been extremely unwell with COVID, and we wish her a very good recovery. And finally, in terms of declarations, I should declare my declaration in the member's interest as a farmer, which agriculture does touch on, certainly on ammonia emissions and maybe others as well. So I do declare my interest as a farmer. I don't think we have any other declarations. And so without any further ado, I move to Angela Richardson to ask the first question, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, panel. Mr. Hill and Mr. Davies, if I can start with you. At the moment, existing policy measures that you've got will not be sufficient to meet the air quality targets for 2030 that government has set out in legislation. Figure 1 in the NAO report compares UK projected emissions to the emission ceilings that have been set, and almost in all cases it looks like they're going to exceed. So we know that you have plans or new plans that you wish to set out in September of this year. How confident are you that there's still time to introduce and implement those plans to help you achieve those targets for 2030 for air quality?
Perhaps if I could answer that. As you say, we're currently in compliance for 4 out of our 5 key pollutants in terms of our 2020 targets, but the projections which we published in March 2021 projected that if we were to extrapolate forward purely on the basis of existing policy and measures, we would likely miss 4 out of 5 of our targets for 2030, and those targets in law become progressively more stretching. Therefore, we are due shortly to publish for consultation a revised draft National Air Pollution Control Plan, and the aim of that plan will be to set out policies and measures designed to bring us into compliance for 2030. In terms of your question, how confident can we be? The work we are doing right now, and we'll, as I say, we'll publish these measures for consultation, is designed to sort of both assure us on feasibility of those measures and the degree of stretch. But I would say we're not starting from scratch. So, for example, we have well-established regimes around our Best Available Techniques programme, which is a programme of continuous improvement working with industry around industrial emissions. And so we can draw some comfort and assurance from that about being able to sort of draw on an existing programme which will drive further improvements over the period. Similarly, on environmental permitting, that's another programme of continual improvement. So I think in terms of the question of feasibility, obviously we'll test this through the consultation before publishing the final plan in September, but we can draw some assurance from that existing body of work that we're currently investing in.
Right, lovely. Mr Davies, did you want to comment at all?
Yes, I mean, just to comment on particularly the NO2 issue. As my colleague David said, we've seen reductions in NO2 over the last decade, around, I think, just over 40% reductions in the levels of NO2 exceedances. I mean, the big issue here, of course, is just the complexity in which the policies that needed to make an impact on this. This is about behaviour change as much as it is around government regulation, and it's making sure that there's actually a sustainable way from a transport perspective for both people to be able to travel around the country, but also ensure that we're able to reduce the exceedances below the legal limits. A large part of this is through some of the regulations on car emissions, and obviously we've seen in the past, so Euro 4, 5 and 6 regulations, but particularly the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, whilst, as the name suggests, focused on decarbonisation, has large air quality benefits as well. So the regulations to limit sales, stop sales of petrol engines in 2030 and zero emissions at the tailpipe by 2035, along with our measures on lorries, HGVs, light vans in the 2040s, will make a big difference on NO2, and that's in addition to the work that's been going on through the Joint Air Quality Unit on particular local authority areas.
Right. Mr Hill, you mentioned the National Air Pollution Control Programme. What do you see as the priorities to be addressed within that programme?
So within that programme, what we will need to do is set out policies and measures for each of the 5 key pollutants, so fine particulate matter, ammonia, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, non-methane volatile organic compounds. So it will be a comprehensive plan which will address what we need to do for each of those to ensure we hit our statutory ceilings for 2030.
Okay, so that's all of them. Is there a priority?
Those are the 5 key pollutants that in law where we have statutory ceilings, so they're all important. What I would say is that we know that fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, is probably one of the most significant in terms of impacts on human health, and so I think there will be a particular focus on that, building on some of the work we've already done. For example, the measures and regulations introduced over the last 18 months or so, for example, to limit the sale of wet wood and coal for domestic burning, which are significant contributors to PM 2.5.
Can I ask what modelling and scenario planning are you doing to determine whether your updated plans will be sufficient to achieve compliance with all the targets?
Yeah, so we have a very, very extensive modelling programme based on our National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory. So the work we're doing now is testing draft policies and measures ahead of consultation to assess the contribution each of those will make to abatement against the national inventory. So there's a very extensive modelling programme underway to do that.
Right. Mr Davies, did you want to comment at all on either of those 2 questions?
Just on the modelling point, there's extensive modelling of the NO2 exceedances that we develop at the national level. It's our pollution climate model, that's based on the 2 networks of both the automatic NO2 monitoring and the more localised urban centres. I mean, it's just really to emphasise the complexity of this modelling. This is not just digesting in the data from these systems. You then need to inform that through things like evidence from local traffic patterns, local fleet structures, because obviously areas with older vehicles will tend to have higher levels of NO2. Similarly, the way in which weather will play, wind, sun, will all change that. The way the modelling will works is not just to give you a snapshot of what's happening now at the points of where the monitoring stations exist. It also then essentially fills the gaps, and we do a map of 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre across the whole country, and in addition along the strategic road network, but also forecast that out to 2030, so we have a more integrated view about what's happening. However, even despite the sort of quality of that work and the level of assurance we have through our chief scientific advisors in both departments, that needs to be supplemented by modelling that happens at the local level, because of the way in which the pollutions operate. the way in which the local road dynamics and the local road layout works will change the way in which the different levels of exceedances happen.
Can I ask you, Mr. Davies, about the dynamism of that modelling? Because it may be anecdotal, but I do several miles. I think the traffic build-up has been, and perhaps Mr. Harris would come in on this, it's now back pretty well to where it was pre-COVID. We're about to get in, well, we are in some pretty warm summer months, which does affect some of these pollutants. So your modelling will presumably be predicting these factors. And then how quickly from that do you then start to alter your national model as to what needs to be done to meet the plan for 2030?
Yeah, so as you say, the traffic patterns post-COVID have been incredibly hard to predict. If you just stand back on the traffic pattern, your intuition's right. On the road network, traffic is back pretty much to where it was before. Slight compositional change, so you've essentially got more white vans and fewer car traffic. Car traffic's about 90%, white vans are around 110. A little change over the week as well, so you're seeing busier at the weekends, less midweek. And it's very hard to know whether this is a new equilibrium post-COVID or not. Similarly, on the rail network, we're still at 70%, but that 70 to 80%. However, that varies incredibly. So business travel, for example, is much lower, commuting travel much lower, leisure travel much higher. So now the weekends are actually some of the busiest times on the rail network. Monday, Friday, much less so. So we have to constantly update those models. The way we work in terms of the NO2 program is to update those models at the point of direction of the local authorities. However, as we then track the forecast with the actual experience, we'll then reiterate that. A good example of this is what's happened in Southampton. Actually, this was before COVID. They had the model at the national level was then developed further by the local authority, as happens in all 64 areas. They were finding, though, that the model was predicting lower levels of NO2 than was actually happening in practice. What essentially was going on with the fleet mix was different to what was predicted, and actually went down even just to where the baseline year for the weather from the Met Office data. So you're right, we do have to update these constantly, and it shows the importance actually of not just relying on the national model, but also working with local authorities and ensuring that their local data and information can be informed into this.
And these machines that we see at the side of the road, can they actually automatically detect all these different air pollutants we've been talking about, or do they only really do NOx and particulates?
I might bring David in on this in a minute, but essentially there's two networks we've got. We've got something called the Automatic Urban Network. That's about 170 sites around the country. That essentially, as the name says, will cover a wide range of particulates. That's supplemented by 300 sites which use smaller, what they call diffusion tubes in the main, and that is just NO2.
Yeah, that's right, Chair. So different monitors can detect different pollutants. We've significantly expanded through the NO2 programme the diffusion tubes which detect the NO2. One of the things we're now investing in, and will invest over 10 million over the next 3 years in, is monitors around PM 2.5, and that's in part in preparation for being able to monitor the targets we're proposing to set for PM 2.5 under the Environment Act. So that investment will strengthen our monitoring capability in that field.
Very helpful. Sorry, Ms. Angela Richardson.
No, that's fine. Chair, thank you very much. So a question for Mr. Hill and Mr. Harris, and I might bring you in first, Mr. Harris, to answer this question. What do you see as the most significant barriers to achieving air quality targets?
So we, just to touch on the modelling, I guess first. So we do extensive modelling across the network in conjunction with colleagues in DFT and DEFRA. And when we look at the whole network, there are at the moment 31 stretches of the network, or links as we call them, that are not in compliance. And perhaps just to touch on the topic of traffic recovering from the pandemic. So we've got some of those links that were predicted to come within compliance, but of course traffic has not been representative in the last 2 years. So as it's now returning, and it's largely returned, we're now monitoring to see if they're in compliance. But what are we doing to the others? So if we go back to 2017, we published our strategy to bring links that weren't in compliance into compliance. And we've been successfully executing on that strategy. And that has meant doing a number of things. So putting in more monitoring. So we now have 64 fixed monitoring points across the network that gives a representative view of what's going on. And in addition, as David said, we have about 186 locations where we do diffusion tube monitoring just to get NOx levels. So we have a representative view. Each location is quite particular. And then we've been developing mitigation measures to bring them into compliance. And these have ranged from looking at building barriers, improving traffic flow, looking at can we have an impact on driver behaviour. We've done a huge range of innovative studies into can we do barriers with different coatings, plant different vegetation, algae, different fuels. And of all of those, we've come up with a series of measures that are effective, because we have to think not only will they be effective at reducing NOx levels, but also we don't want to do something that will displace traffic onto other roads, which might have a worse pollution impact. So we've come up with a suite of effective measures that include lowering the speed limit, typically from 70 to 60. We're starting to develop barriers. We found the barriers have to be over 9 meters to be effective, and some resequencing of traffic lights, encouraging HGVs to use different routes. So of the 31 locations or links where there are or were exceedances, we've now got mitigation measures in place on 14 of those. And I'm hopeful that as we now do the monitoring with representative levels of traffic, we'll see an improvement in compliance. But there are 17 links where we're still working on finding effective mitigation measures, and that we will continue to do.
Am I right in saying those 31 areas identified, there was a report, it came out just over a year ago, it's about February, March time 2021, and I think the figures that were taken were during a COVID period where there wasn't so much traffic on the road. So as you're talking about traffic coming back into play, will there be likely more than 31 areas that actually fall into range?
So I guess a couple of things to mention in that. One is... I'm
only asking because Guildford in my constituency,
yes, yeah.
I think, is number one on the strategic road network. So I've been paying quite careful attention to it.
To that. So just to talk specifically about Guildford, but before looking at Guildford, if I talk about 31, so some of them, because that data wasn't, as I said, representative, some of them we will likely find they've come into compliance. There may be others, of course, because pattern of pollution has changed. Modelling data shows us new links to look at. But of all of the 31 links we're looking at, Guildford is the highest, which is why, and then there are a couple of issues at Guildford, but to talk about air quality specifically, which is the most urgent and most important thing that we address, we're looking at developing a 9-metre high barrier, in fact, two 9-metre high barriers in the centre of Guildford. We're also looking at the relocation of the cycling path. And then we're looking more widely at the problem, because this is all about how do we together reduce the creation of pollution. So we're supporting and working together with Guildford and Surrey councils on an electric vehicle scheme to help promote the shift to electric vehicles. And we've done this successfully in other locations. The other thing, of course, as you know, we're looking at in Guildford is there's a problem with congestion as well. So we're looking at options. So
I don't want to divert the committee too much on the particular matters of Guildford. But the question was about barriers, and you talked about putting up barriers, which is all, and you talked about solutions. But really what I'm trying to get to is what do you think will be the barriers in order to achieve those air quality? What are the problems you're tackling?
So, I mean, there are a number of challenges, and I think the thing I would like to stress to the committee, it's not through want of looking for solutions. I mean, we're continually looking for for new solutions, which include looking at how do we reduce the overall pollution, so encouraging the shift to electric vehicles or finding alternative routes. But the challenges are effective solutions that we've so far got are reducing speed limits, putting barriers in place.
Do you see potential issues with planning, for instance, of being able to do some of the things that you want to do?
So, I mean, if you let's take Guildford as an example. I mean, and other locations will be similar. We have found through extensive work, and it's really important that we only put in place mitigation measures that are going to be effective. We've tried 3-metre high barriers, 6-metre high barriers, and we've done a lot of work studying the impact of 9-metre high barriers, in particular in Holland. And it is only at 9 metres that you're seeing an effective reduction in NO2 levels on the other side of the barrier. So that's the solution we're looking at, or one of the solutions we're looking at for Guildford and other locations. Of course, a 9-metre high barrier has to go through a planning process, and which no doubt will not be straightforward.
Okay.
If you live right next to a 9-metre barrier, it's like living in Colditz.
It's a substantial structure, three stories. Yeah.
It is. Well, I'm sure this is a discussion that we're going to have ongoing over a period of time, so we'll take that out of the committee now and probably follow that up later. But Mr. Hill.
Yeah, perhaps I could just sort of add to what Mr. Harris was saying about barriers. I mean, I think there are different challenges relating to different pollutants. So as Mr. Davies was saying earlier, if we think about sulfur dioxide, for example, we've seen a 70% reduction over the last 10 years in sulfur dioxide, principally through best available techniques in terms of industrial emissions. So working technically with big industrial emitters on how they can bring those down. But to some extent, we've kind of captured those low-hanging fruit. And so I think if you look at other emissions, the barriers are different. If you take NO2, for example, the programme that's the focus of the NAO's report, one of the things that will drive compliance over time is fleet upgrades. The rate at which we can replace older, dirtier vehicles with newer, cleaner vehicles. So some of the barriers there are around supply chains. Whether we can and the pace at which we can move with that. Different again, I think, with ammonia. So. Ammonia agriculture in this country accounts for around 87% of ammonia emissions. And so crucially, being able to have an impact on ammonia emissions depends on agricultural practice, that depends on how farmers manage their land, and therefore we need to find ways of supporting farmers with good advice, but also some financial support to change the way that they work. And so on many pollutants, actually behaviour change is really important, and the quality of our communication and engagement with different businesses and different sectors is important.
You take me nicely onto my next topic, which is ammonia.
Okay.
Right at the beginning, you talked about meeting 4 out of 5 of the 2020 targets, but I think ammonia is the one where the government may not have met its legal ceiling for national emissions by 2020. And you've already touched on the fact that 87% of ammonia emissions come from agriculture. So my first question to you is, when did it become clear that the UK might miss its 2020 ammonia target, and what action have you taken as a result of that?
So the fact that we may miss the target became clear as we published the annual projections, and the last projections were published in 2021. We are applying for a legal adjustment because some sources of ammonia emissions have come on stream, in effect, non-manure digestates, since the commitment was set. But that may well actually bring us into technical compliance, but that's not to underplay that this is a challenging target and a challenging statutory ceiling, and certainly absent new measures, we would miss the 2030 target. As I said, crucially, agricultural practice is at the heart of how we tackle this, and so we're seeking to do a number of things to try and work with farmers to embed more sustainable practices in terms of bringing down ammonia emissions. So that includes a number of things. For example, we work with the industry on a code of agricultural practice, which is now out there. We're seeking to extend, by doubling the catchment sensitive farming programme, advice and guidance available to farmers. And then there's a range of financial assistance available, some through, for example, existing countryside stewardship schemes, which offer £100,000 grants towards slurry covers, but there'll be further investment on slurry infrastructure coming forward in the autumn. We've also been working with the sector on action to reduce emissions from fertilisers containing urea. And we've agreed with the industry that we will support an industry-led scheme under the Red Tractor scheme, which will, in effect, require urease inhibitors to be part of the application of urea-based fertilisers in the future. So there's a range of measures that we're working through to try and support the farming sector to adjust on this. And we will consult on further measures later this year, both in the NAPCP, but also we will be consulting on the management of organic manures as well.
So my next question is, why are you not setting a long-term objective for reducing ammonia emissions?
So we will have a 2030 statutory target, and the NAPCP will seek to address that. I think you're referring to the suite of targets that we're setting under the Environment Act, where we're proposing to set 2 targets around PM 2.5, and that's in particular because of the health impacts of PM 2.5, and that's why the government has chosen to focus on those as the main focus for the long-term targets.
Okay. You've talked about some of the things and the practices you're encouraging the agricultural sector to put in place. Have you got any concerns about the fact that we've got a new food production strategy? We're actually trying to increase productivity in farming as a political decision, I suppose, of the government to try and help with food security, which is a concern. Do you see there being any sort of issues in increased ammonia outputs as a result of potentially more farming in this country?
So I think the government's objectives are around ensuring we have food security, but also improving the sustainability of the sector as well. And I don't think those two things are necessarily in tension. It's a very important part of the future farming reforms that we invest in productivity, and there's a productivity improvement fund to support improvements in agricultural practice. So the food strategy was published with these air quality and other environmental objectives in mind. It is of course the case that right now farmers are facing very, very high fertiliser prices. There's a lot of pressure on the industry, and for that reason it was agreed that the introduction of the Red Tractor scheme, which I mentioned specifically around urea-based fertilisers, would be deferred a year, and that's in recognition of some of the immediate pressure the sector is under.
Do you want to ask any questions on that at all?
I've got 1 or 2 questions to pick up on. So if I could pick up on one or 2 areas. Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Can I go back to you, Nick Harris, and talk about those 31 non-compliant areas that you manage, and in particular the 17 where you say there is sections with no viable measures. That sounds a little bit passive to me. I accept that if we turn to figure 8 on page 42, 15 are forecast to be compliant by 2026 and 2 are non-compliant by 2030. But nevertheless, I wonder if there is more that your agency can do in these areas, particularly the 17. It sounds a bit sort of passive, that you could do more.
So I would say not at all passive, and I'm very clear that we have a very clear responsibility, and indeed a legal responsibility, to bring them into compliance in the shortest time possible. Now, some of them, between now and 2030, are likely to come into compliance, but that doesn't mean we're just sat around waiting for that to happen. We continue with the programme, and I mentioned earlier some of the innovations and mitigation measures we're looking at. So we continue to pursue that. In recent times, we've run competitions to try and bring even more innovation into this space. So we're not giving up yet on finding physical methods of mitigating against those 17. But we're also looking more widely, looking at where can we change behaviours, be that in the pattern of using the roads. So there are examples where we can encourage HGVs to go one way rather than another, and also to support much more widely the shift to electric vehicles, which might hasten these links coming into compliance. So we're looking at supporting the rollout of EV charging points, the schemes that we're running to encourage the take-up of electric vehicles. And perhaps just to put it into context, so the 31 that we talked about, that in total, if you add it all up, is about 51 miles of 4,500 miles of roads that we look after. And that's not to make light of those 17. We're still very focused on them. But we will leave no stone unturned to try and bring them into compliance as soon as we can.
That's very helpful. I'm sure we will get on to this a little bit later on, but it does strike me that if you were a local authority alongside one of those areas, are you helping the local authorities at least with data, if nothing, no other help, because they're going to have to deal with the problem away from your roads?
Yeah, so we publish a lot of data and information, and we share that with partners in the local authorities. Of course, we're working with a number of them on supporting clean air zones and the signage that's needed for that. Certainly, there was a criticism in the NAO report about how easy is it to access our data, and I've very much taken that on board. We do have on our website interactive maps that you can use to get at data, but certainly we're looking at how can we understand better with Gareth and David what information do people want to look at, and how can we make it more accessible?
I think we're going to come on to this whole communication strategy, but I see, Mr. Davies, you would like to come in.
It's just really to build on what Nick was saying around, I wanted to give assurance to the committee on 2 points. One, on the partnership working between National Highways and my department. Tackling some of the exceedances on the strategic road network is difficult. This is not just a challenge that we're facing in this country. This is frankly an international challenge. We've been working with governments around the world. I mean, Nick mentioned the work in Holland and looking at Dordrecht and the use of the 9-metre curved barrier. There's a high risk of wasting taxpayers' money on some of the measures, and we've been very careful to make sure that we are protecting ourselves for value for money, recognising that the overarching goal here is reducing NO2 exceedances, but there's no point spending money if it has either no impact or, at worst, a deleterious impact. On the second point, you raised a really important point about work with the local authorities, and I know Nick works closely with the local authorities. Again, one of the big concerns on the strategic road network is a risk of displacement, and a risk that you actually displace heavy vehicle traffic into local roads, which shifts where the exceedances might occur, which is a problem for local authorities. Also a big traffic safety risk as well. So again, there are a range of considerations that we need to bring into bear here whilst maintaining that number one focus on air quality.
Whilst we're on this area, I travel the M4 twice a week, and I curse for the speed limits. But actually, when I read this report, I always thought the speed limits were there to try and improve road safety, which I'm sure they are. But actually, they are contributing to better road air quality.
Yeah.
But why don't you publicise that a bit better?
So we do on our website, but clearly not well enough. So that's something we are looking to improve, because sometimes it is for safety reasons, but has the beneficial impact on air quality. And there are at least 4 locations where it is purely driven by air quality concerns. But yes, we'll take the point that we can publicise it.
And
more.
you've mentioned electric vehicles several times. So let me go to you, Mr. Hill, and ask, firstly, the withdrawal of the home charger grants. How is that going to help people to make a behavioural change to want to buy a more expensive electric car?
I might ask Gareth, actually, as electric vehicles is a DFT lead.
Sorry.
No,
Okay.
sorry. Essentially, the scheme has exceeded the goals that were set for it when it was originally brought in back over 10 years ago now. I think if you look at the sales of electric vehicles, the latest figures around 1 in 6 new cars are electric. When I speak to manufacturers, all the constraints now are not on the demand side, they're on the supply side. So we're seeing strong demand for electric vehicles. That's why originally the home charging scheme was brought in, was to encourage, as you say, people to shift. We don't see that being a constraint. The cost of electric vehicles relative to the cost of petrol engine cars is decreased over time. So that's the financial, and obviously given the current fuel price situation, that is shifting even more so now. So the constraint isn't on that side. So what we want to do, and to make sure best use of taxpayers' money, is to shift that grant now more into the infrastructure. Because if you look at the issues that users of electric vehicles are concerned about, or people who are considering shifting to electric, one of the main concerns that we get through our qualitative research is on public charging. People who have got driveways obviously can plug in overnight, and that's 70% of car owners have driveways, so they can plug in overnight. So there's 2 issues. One is on long distance. Batteries are getting a lot better, but we're still not there. We've got obviously the policy to have rapid chargers at all motorway service stations. The second issue, which is a more thorny challenge, is one around how you do local charging for people who live in flats, terrace housing and the like. And as you'll have seen, there's lots of work that local authorities have been leading to put in place chargers. You'll see them in lampposts. There's some interesting trials around pop-up charge points. We know we need to really expand this work. Currently there are just over 30,000 public charge points in the UK. We published research earlier this year saying we need to be, estimates are uncertain as ever when you look out 10 years, but we think we need to around 300,000, so 10 times increase in the number of charge points. We're about to launch a fund, the Local Charge Point Fund, which we're now just designing to work with local authorities to increase that scale. But that is primarily where the challenge is now on the electric vehicle transition, rather than the affordability of the car up front.
On that general theme, and given your 2 big goals, one is that you're going to ban sales of internal combustion engine by 2030 and stop use by 2035, do you see the ramping up of electric vehicle purchases at the moment sufficient to be able to meet those targets?
Yeah, so at the moment, looking at the trajectory, certainly it is higher than, from memory, and I can confirm to you on this one by writing, but from memory they are higher than our previous forecasts of the sales at this point. Certainly 1 in 16, and it peaked even higher during some points over the last 2 years. So that looks, trajectory is always hard because you're not quite sure at what point of the S-curve you're on, but certainly that looks faster. It's fair to say that that's on the sale of cars rather than the stock of cars. So even if all our projections come to pass, I think the stock of cars will still be 1 in 3 cars will be electric in 2030. So the majority will still be petrol engine cars. So we'll still have this double running system for a number of decades to come.
There's going to be an awful lot of work to do between 2030 and 2035.
Yeah, and both those targets are on the sales of new cars. So it will take time for the stock, obviously, to work.
Are you thinking about introducing any scrappage schemes for those that can't afford it?
Yes, so some local authorities have certainly brought in scrappage schemes, and we are looking at the evaluations of those schemes, because there's always a risk of essentially dead weight. You're paying for things that people would have done anyway. But there are some evidence that does accelerate the shift. But as I say, the biggest issue now is twofold. One is the supply of cars, and you've seen the constraints created, given China and the lockdowns in China, but also Ukraine as well, and on infrastructure.
Before I bring in Kate Green, can I just pick up on one thing that you said, Mr. Hill? And this was this legal adjustment to the definition of ammonia. Isn't that just a fudge, or is it a real issue?
So it's a technical issue to do with a new source of ammonia emissions, which is non-manure digestates, that was not factored into the original calculation of our original commitment. So it is a technical adjustment. I wouldn't want to overstate that at all in terms of the scale of the challenge on bringing ammonia emissions down. So I wouldn't want to overplay that. And everything I said about the range of things we would need to do towards 2030 stands.
All right, I hear that I cut you off, Mr. Davies.
I was wondering if you wanted to come on ammonia.
Particulates, very important.
It's very important, actually. So I just want to move on to particulate matter. In the NAO report, for those watching who may not have had a chance to read it, Public Health England estimated in 2018 that reducing fine particulate matter concentrations by 1 microgram per cubic metre could, over 18 years, prevent huge numbers of cases in coronary heart disease, strokes, cases of asthma and lung cancers. So it's really important, and the WHO have obviously also said that it's not yet found a concentration of fine particulate matter below which no damage to human health is observed. So I think we all agree how important it is to tackle this. So my question to Mr. Hill and Mr. Davies is, what are you doing to ensure that the new legislative targets for particulate matter will be realistic and affordable, also given how important it is?
Yes, thank you. So we're proposing to set 2 targets under the Environment Act framework: a concentration target, a concentration target to deal with particular hotspots, but also an exposure target, which is to seek to drive progressive improvement in PM 2.5 levels everywhere. And those 2 things working in conjunction is important. And our estimates are that, subject to the outcome of the consultation, that we estimate those targets could see 214,000 fewer cases of cardiovascular disease, 57,000 fewer stroke cases than would otherwise have occurred, and 70,000 fewer asthma cases. So a significant impact. We are obliged in law to set targets that we think are achievable and achievable in all parts of the country. And that's important when thinking about PM 2.5 because of the range of sources of PM 2.5, including pollution that's blown in from other countries and also naturally occurring sources. So what we're seeking to do is sort of calibrate a level that we think is both stretching, but actually we're confident that we have the policies and measures that we think could get us there.
You're not proposing to meet the WHO guideline concentrations, which is ambitious.
So the WHO have brought forward recommendations around 5 micrograms per cubic metre. The challenge with 5 micrograms is our modelling suggests that in some parts of the country, those other sources that I just described, so naturally occurring sources of particulate matter and indeed transboundary pollution, could mean that even if there were no man-made emissions in some parts of the country, you would still be above 5. So I don't think in any case has the WHO sort of recommended that 5 micrograms should be written into legal frameworks in any country. I think what they're saying is, as you said in your opening question, there's no safe limit. So the object of the policy is to seek to drive down as far and as fast as we practically can.
Okay, Mr. Davies.
Just on a personal basis, I lived in China for 2 years working, and there you'd often see the levels of pollution. It's sort of 10, if not 20 times current UK levels, let alone WHO. So you can really see on a personal level the importance of reducing particulate matter. On transport, we've talked a lot about NO2, and obviously the move to electric vehicles will make a big difference over time as a fleet turns over to reduce NO2 levels. However, what it doesn't remove is the impact that transport will have on PM 2.5. I think from memory, around half of the impact of PM 2.5 will be from 2 factors. One is on brake pads and the small particles that are released at that point. Similarly on tyres, and again the friction on the wheels to the roads. as you can imagine, that's very hard to actually to solve, because the friction is what you need to move the car. We are working with a number of universities now to look at options for how we can tackle and reduce the emissions of small particulates from cars, including electric vehicles, but there's no simple solution on this.
That's very helpful. Can I just go on now in terms of the spending on this? In the NAO report, paragraph 1.16, it says government could not provide a breakdown of committed and actual spend across portfolios of air quality initiatives. So, Mr. Hill, why do you not know the overall level of government spending on air quality?
So I think we do have good data on programmes where their primary purpose is around reducing air pollution. So the NO2 programme itself, £880 million programme, but also the programmes that DEFRA leads around local air quality as well. I think where it's more challenging, and it's a technical challenge, is where some of the programmes that Gareth's department, for example, is responsible for, some of the big active travel programmes, some of the decarbonisation programmes, it is technically quite difficult to sort of disaggregate what's the air quality impact of that. So we have done that where, for example, we've done a deep dive on assessing what are the air quality co-benefits of meeting our net zero commitments over the period from 2020 to 2050, but to track that on an annual rolling basis across the full span of government programmes and sort of disaggregate the components that bite on air quality is just a very technically difficult and challenging thing to do, and therefore we sought to focus on those things like the NO2 programme where we can drive those very hard.
Can I stop you there, Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Because I think this is absolutely crucial, that we do have complete transparency and complete costs on all of this from all government departments, because you take the lead on it, but there are other departments. We've got obviously the Department of Transport here, but we haven't got the Department of Levelling Up here, we haven't got the Department of Business here. I think it is quite important that we, when the public wants to know whether we're meeting these targets or whether we're not, how much government as a whole is spending on them, and whether we're getting value for money for that spend. So I wonder, you say it's technically difficult. I wonder if you as the lead department could let us have a note as to why it is so technically difficult and what more can be done to obtain the data across government.
Yes, very happy to write on that point. I think, Gareth, you wanted to add?
I was going to offer to try and bring it to light for the committee, and we can happily follow up in correspondence. So I'll come back to the electric vehicle infrastructure programme. This is part of the wider transport decarbonisation plan, which was published over a year ago now. The primary goal of government funding for electric vehicle infrastructure is to encourage a shift to electric vehicles, which is and its primary focus is on decarbonisation, reducing the carbon emissions of petrol engines. However, there will be important benefits from that shift, one of which is on air quality. So the technical issue is not a financial accounting issue of trying to sort of allocate it out. It's more a conceptual issue. The single pound spent will have two benefits, at least two benefits. One on decarbonisation, one on air quality. So the risk is then is sort of the allocation question of how you then risk becoming arbitrary in terms of how you allocate the monies.
Well, unless you do seek to allocate it, the public out there will think you're spending an enormous amount on CO2 emissions and not paying sufficient attention to all these other, equally, as Ms. Richardson has made clear, very harmful, some of them, pollutants.
I can totally see where the NAO was coming from in terms of this analysis, and I think the only risk I'd flag is where we would have to end up is being essentially in double counting, because it would be impossible to unpick whether for example, a single charge point was around decarbonisation or air quality. But we can come back to
note, then we can understand some of those issues. And thank you for the explanation. That's really helpful. Sorry, Ms. Richardson.
I'm happy to finish there.
Oh, Chair. Thank you very much. Kate Green, you've been waiting patiently. Sorry, you're going to start on Knox.
Thank you. Could I start by asking a little bit more about how your departments and National Highways work with local authorities in terms of development of strategy, in terms of the role of the Clean Air Service, which has been criticised by some local authorities. You mentioned data sharing, Mr. Harris. But I think knowing what the other party is doing doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the tools in your hand to address the problems that are being created, and in terms of funding. So how do you see this do you see this as a partnership between central government and local authorities, or do you see it as two parallel efforts working within an overall framework of national ambitions and targets?
Perhaps I start and you amplify. So I think we do see it as a partnership. In terms of how do we go about engaging and working with local authorities, so our modelling assessments will assess whether or not exceedances are projected in a local authority area, and if our modelling suggests that there is in effect a kind of case to answer, that there's a problem to be addressed, then we will, through the joint unit between our two departments, we will work with those authorities to bring forward a plan. And the level of rigour of the plan depends essentially on how long exceedances are projected to last for. So if the modelling suggests an exceedance will last for 3 years or more, then a local authority would be directed to bring forward a full local plan. It would be a more proportionate response if exceedances could be tackled in shorter order. In terms of our support in that development phase, each local authority would have access to an account manager, so that's a member of the team who can work with that local authority to help them understand what they need to do, how they can build up their business case. They'd also have access to our science expertise, a science lead and a technical lead as well. And for those authorities that move into, for example, implementation of a clean air zone, so charging measures, there's a more intensive package of support, including project management support, digital support as well. You asked about the Clean Air Zone service, and it might just be worth me saying a word or two about that as well. So, because the goal of this programme and the obligations handed down by the court are about securing compliance with the court ruling to reduce exceedances in the shortest time possible, we took the view that it was necessary to build a central framework that different local authorities could then bolt onto as the programme progressed, and hence that's why we built elements of a standard offer around the infrastructure needed to run clean air zones. And so we worked quite intensively with early adopters, or including through the alpha phase of the digital build, to test what we needed to build and what it made sense to go to secure compliance in the shortest time possible, where it made sense to have a centrally led offer. So that, but crucially, what we don't do is sort of determine, for example, the mix of exemptions that local authorities might wish to apply in their local area. So Birmingham, which has a clean air zone, for example, offers certain exemptions for those who live and work in the zone, or for those on lower incomes who have to drive into the zone for work. So we don't dictate that from the centre. We work with those local authorities so they can make those judgments about what works best for their area, but with a platform of that central support from central government.
And that's, you'll forgive me, a fairly central and prescriptive approach, with some discretion, as you say, around the mix of charging and so on. But why is it that you are confident that that is a better way of achieving the legal obligations than working in a more partnership-based, holistic way with local authorities? That's because a Greater Manchester MP, we feel very strongly that we could have developed a broader approach than simply relying on charging, that could have put together a package to do with the use of EV and low-emission vehicles, around promoting active travel routes, revenue support for low fares and so on. Why is it that government is so confident that the charging model is the best and quickest way to achieve the legal obligations?
So we're led by the evidence on the charging model. So across the 64 authorities that have been involved in the programme at some point, some of those, a proportion of those, were found on further interrogation to already be in compliance. But this programme has touched 64 authorities. So in terms of the approach we've developed, it's been predicated essentially on having some common platforms that a range of authorities can build out from over time. On charging specifically, though, what we seek to do in each locality is sort of assess through our modelling, tested locally, validated against local monitoring and measurement, which mix of measures will secure compliance in the shortest time possible, and then we're able to benchmark that across different authorities. So there's no prescription that says charging is the right answer. But what we are obliged to do is sort of test whether a charging solution is likely, based on all our evidence, to drive compliance faster than non-charging measures. So that's the process we go through with each authority. That's validated by an independent panel of experts, both on the science but also on delivery. So we have 2 panels which look at different aspects of the local authority business cases.
Yet there are still quite a substantial number of authorities, aren't there, that have not been able to progress as quickly as is needed. What are you doing to support those local authorities
Yes.
and to ensure that their plans and budgets are achievable?
Yes, so there are a small number of authorities, and we touched earlier on cases on the strategic road network where we haven't been able to identify viable measures to bring forward the date of compliance. There are a small number of authorities where, similarly, we have not been able to identify measures that in those authorities would bring forward the date of compliance. That doesn't mean we can't improve air quality. So Leicester would be an example of this, where we couldn't identify measures. Well, a charging zone could not have been implemented in time in Leicester, for example, in order to make a positive difference to the date of compliance, but we're still providing financial support to Leicester to invest in measures which will nonetheless improve air quality in those localities. And as the NAO has picked up in its report, there's a relatively small number of authorities where that set of circumstances has applied, and the NAO has, I think, rightly challenged us about, from what we've learned on working with those authorities, can we develop a clearer set of criteria about how an authority should handle those situations of no viable measures, and that's certainly a recommendation I think we're keen to sort of pick up and work with.
How does all this sit alongside wider government levelling up ambitions?
So, I mean, it's a very big question, I think, for us around how a programme that was set up explicitly to be time limited to meet the judgments that the court has handed down, but we're learning a huge amount from that programme, and in many of our conversations with local authorities, learning a lot about how not just the direct measures we might take on exceedances, but how urban design, the quality of life in a locality, the measures we might do to educate local communities, the legacy of the programme. So I think that's one of the things we're working on now, is thinking about, as this programme comes to the end of its natural life, what have we learned from that, and what does that mean for the design of other big programmes, some of Gareth's big funding programmes around transforming cities, for example, where we can take the learning from the NO2 programme and see that reflected in wider mainstream programmes. And it is, I think, important to the levelling up agenda, because we do know, and the evidence suggests, that the adverse impacts of poor air quality, the health impacts, are felt disproportionately in more disadvantaged communities.
Mind if I just come in, Mr. Kate Green? You've mentioned several times, Mr. Hill, learning. And now I know that London doesn't come within the specific funding of this scheme, but it is, after all, the largest charging zone anywhere in the country. So what lessons are you learning from London, how well it is or isn't working? And London is split into different areas, and learning those lessons to apply to this scheme for all the other local authorities.
Yes, so we've worked closely with Transport for London as we were developing the NO2 programme. I think there are some material differences as well. Scale is important in terms of the scale of the ULEZ compared to much of what we're doing in many places. Manchester is probably the exception to what I'm about to say, because Manchester's scale is quite different, because it's that partnership of 10 Greater Manchester authorities, quite different to pretty much any other authority or group of authorities in the NO2 programme. So we've worked closely with TfL, and I would say actually the learning process is a two-way thing. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we designed into our programme at a relatively early stage was the use of live feed data from DVLA which took longer to build, but gives us a more accurate set of data around vehicle compliance in clean air zones. And I believe TfL are now interested in whether some of that learning could be applied in London. So there's an ongoing two-way process of dialogue with our counterparts in London. We do, though, also for the NO2 programme have a very, very extensive annual evaluation programme. So as and I think the NAO acknowledged this in its report. So we are each year we will publish an annual evaluation report, and that will capture what we know already about the impacts of the programme. And for those authorities with clean air zones, we will do a full lessons learned exercise on the implementation and rollout of the zone in each locality. What could we have improved upon? What could we do better? And then that feeds through into successor waves of authorities for the future.
I'm sorry, when I came in, I didn't realise, Mr. Davies, you were wanting to respond to Ms. Green's last question on local authorities. Did you want to come back in on that?
So I respond to your last question, and then I might, if that's okay.
Well, that would be more logical. Thank you.
Yes, it might help my mind anyway. Otherwise, I might get myself in a muddle.
Certainly be more orderly for our report.
I will do my best. Just 2 points I was going to add to what David said about working with TfL, and it has been good partnership working with officials to understand the sort of complexities of the implementation, particularly around developing the central IT platform. This is a complex, IT platform to have real-time data for the vehicles. We wanted to understand exactly how TfL had designed it. We made some changes, as David said, but we wanted to understand exactly through the discovery and alpha phases the best way of implementing that, and particularly the in-source versus outsource decision. We decided to build it in-house, given the need to have flexibility of the system and work with a number of different local authorities. So that was an important learning. The second thing we've been watching very closely is how TfL have expanded the size of the ULEZ, and particularly most recently, obviously, to the North and South Circulars. Touches on what Nick was saying before around the strategic road network, the question of displacement, because as ever in transport policy, you have to be very careful about what happens on the border and the boundaries of different policy areas. I've been watching carefully to make sure the transport displacement is not having a deleterious effect in local areas. If I can jump back to your question around, I thought there's a really important point, this issue of partnership working with local authorities. I think this programme will fail if it's seen to be a top-down programme done by national government. It will fail in a number of ways. One, because the way in which the national modelling works, and we do excellent national modelling, even despite the quality of the work which is assured by independent academics, that needs to be translated into what's happening at the local level, the local road network, the local fleet patterns, frankly, local weather. So that is that's a core part that we need to work with local authorities. If we'd just done this nationally, 16 areas, we would have had 16 more areas exploring programs, when in fact they are already compliant because of the calibration that was done at the local level. Secondly, and this comes into your question around the link to levelling up, I've been very impressed by the way in which local authorities haven't just been seeing this as a compliance issue. Obviously, you've got a court direction, yes, we have to comply it, but they're seeing it more broadly as part of their transport policy and their local regeneration policy. So I was in Birmingham recently with Tamara, and there the local authority went through very compellingly how they are embedding this not just as a short-term programme to reduce NO2 compliance, but to think more broadly around what they want from their street map, their traffic profile, and local health, not just from air quality, but also from active travel, issues around obesity and travelling as well. So I think that's the way in which it can really work. But that's why the partnership is absolutely critical. I think in some ways the language we have to use around directions to local authorities isn't very helpful. Yes, we have to legally direct local authorities to come up with a plan, but critically that plan needs to be local authority owned. It's then baselined against a clean air zone. But as ministers have said, that should be a last resort, not a first resort. But critically, it's got to be a local authority plan.
Are you thinking of revisiting that assumption that the baseline is the clean air zone, given that there have been obviously quite a number of authorities that have experienced significant delays in implementing it?
This comes back to the evaluation. We published the latest annual assessment of, and this focused on BAF, given the experience there. As David touched on, the evidence is right that the clean air zone is the fastest way to achieve compliance, and that's why that's the baseline. If there are ways in which local authorities can put together a package of measures that would achieve compliance faster, well, we're very open to that. It's all about, for us, it's not about the means, it's the ends, and the end is how do you achieve compliance as fast as possible.
I wonder if I could return to Mr. Harris for a moment about the strategic road network. And again, you talked about making data available to local authorities, and Mr. Davies, you've talked about the need not to displace polluting traffic from the strategic road network onto the local road network next door. But in fact, from the point of view of residents, that's not a very clear-cut different set of roads. I can think of, again, with Greater Manchester examples in mind, the M60 in my own constituency, and people in Urmston live right underneath it on the local road network. It doesn't really matter to them whether you do or don't displace the traffic. It's already right past their front doors pretty well. Equally, I can think of Regent Road in Salford, which starts as the strategic road network at the M602 end and becomes part of the clean air zone at the city centre end. Do you think that there's more scope for holistic planning of how the strategic road network and local road networks can achieve clean air targets?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly becomes more challenging as the roads that we look after come into contact with urban areas. So I think there's sort of 3 or 4 ways that we're approaching it. I mean, one at the national level, as Gareth has been talking about, we work very closely with the Joint Air Quality Unit to make sure that we're supporting and coordinating what we do. And then, I mean, it's very interesting that a lot of this, through the subnational transport bodies, becomes part of the way they look at transport policy. So we work in very close partnership with the 7 subnational transport bodies. They're all a little bit different. And we're finding that relationship very effective to talk about and develop some of these opportunities. And then we work at a more local level, particularly thinking about the clean air zones. So what can we do to help in terms of signage? And of course, some of our roads are in the clean air zones, as you said. So if we have exceedances, then that's something we work together with the local authority concerned. And then we're also looking at what else can we do. So that's the sort of the very particular specifics of our roads and their compliance. But we're also very keen to look at what else can we do, particularly when we're looking at the way that transport is being developed. So we have a fund that we look after called a designated fund. There are a number of objectives to this, but a large part of it is aimed at environment and communities. And that's where we do actively support active travel, the funding for the electric car schemes charging or switch to electric vehicles that we've talked about. And we look at other opportunities. I think we're the largest developer of cycle schemes in the country, which so anything we can do to encourage active travel helps.
Mr. Hill wants to come in, but I just wanted to ask, in terms of people who are affected by the exceedances on the national network and the 31 areas that we're still concerned about, where the 31 sites where we're still seeing these exceedances and we haven't got plans to reduce them. How many residents will be affected by that? Are you able to say it in human terms?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, looking back at Guildford is probably one of the more challenging locations which we talked about earlier. But I mean, looking at NO2 levels, they tend to drop off. It drops off quite quickly from the road. I mean, it really depends on the topography and prevailing winds and all those local features. But our best view is that around about, if you take all of the 31 links, and not just the 17 we talked about, there's around about 240 to 250 houses or properties affected, because many of the links that are not in that are in exceedance are not in urban areas.
Mr. Hill, I know you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to add one point on your question about does this need a more holistic approach and partnership. And just to sort of flag that one of the things we've sought to do in the 2021 Environment Act is strengthen the obligations on a range of partner organisations to work with local authorities who have the legal obligation to review and plan for local air quality in their areas. So certainly National Highways will be in scope of that as one of those organisations, and that's really to give local authorities more purchase over bringing different partners to the table on what they need in their area to tackle air quality issues in the round.
Yeah, I noted what Mr. Davies said about ends not means, and if there are other ways of achieving ambitions, local authorities should be able to bring in partners and work with them to do that. Chair, I would like to ask some questions later about public communications and information, but I'm fine on that section now. Thank you.
We should be plenty of time at the end. I think I'm now going to go back to Angela Richardson. You on a range of questions, or if not, I will come in. But you have a start, and then I will.
Well, no, I'm happy to with Kate pick up on the communications.
Right. We haven't quite got there yet. So let's just examine these the Joint Committee and the local authorities implementing these plans, Mr. Hill, because the NRO report at paragraph 3.23 considers that 38 local authorities that have implemented are implementing or planning. Of the 38 who are planning or implementing measures, 25% missed the legal deadline for providing a full business case. So what are you doing about them?
So a range of things. So I think it's fair to say that for a number of those authorities, COVID would have had an impact. The onset of the pandemic would have had an impact on their ability to deliver their business cases within the original legal deadline, and so we work really closely with the authorities through some of the things I was describing before, some of the technical support we offer around science, around modelling, to try and help local authorities in terms of putting those business cases together. The experience of those that went first is also really important. We're shipped through the account manager function. We're sharing some of that experience with successor local authorities, and that also should help in getting things back on track. But we also do have a range of legal levers as well. We can further issue new directions, as we have done on a number of occasions, if there's persistent slippage. But really we do seek to approach this in a spirit of, we recognise the local authorities being asked to do something difficult and challenging, and I think our job is to make sure that our technical capabilities and our analysis are available to support them. Gareth, you might talk about that.
I think it's fair to say, when I reflect on the project, on the overall programme, the business case has been the most challenging phase. It's been less around the implementation of the measures. It's been much more around actually that business case development. We set very ambitious timelines for business cases right at the start, typically just shy of a year, a little bit of variation around that. Of the, I think it's 25 areas that you mentioned that have been delayed, there's been a wide variation in the amount of delays, some literally just a couple of weeks, on average around 5 to 9 months. The challenge has been, we're asking a lot of local authorities. They had to convert the national model that I talked about into a local model, and that's not without, that involves a lot of work. That's not an automatic process. They need to do public engagement, and so you'll know, obviously, Greater Manchester have had both an informal and a formal period of consultation, which actually is really important to ensure public acceptability of any of the proposals. Developing a set of proposals and understanding the road layouts that might be affected, testing those models before developing the OBC and then the FBC. So that business case process has been particularly complex. This has been important to get right, and I'll bring that if I can bring that to life with two examples. One in Leeds, where the national model was suggesting that they would need to move to a clean air zone. And actually, as we worked through the details, actually they were found to be close to compliance already, and are able to use non-charging measures. So as a result of the working through the business case process, we were able to ensure that we didn't wrongly put in place a clean air zone, and they're actually able to have local measures. Flip side has been in Southampton, where actually the local model was showing that it was out of kilter with what was happening in terms of actual levels of NO2. And so that needed a recalibration and further work. So I think on reflection on the overall programme, we were very ambitious on the timelines then. I think rightly, because of the court direction, but it's important that we didn't lose that local engagement right at the start.
So does that answer also cover the 8 local authorities who missed their compliance deadlines?
On compliance, there's 2 issues here. One is that's in part due to delays in both the business case, but also on implementing some of the measures. Birmingham is a good example of that. More generally on compliance, the challenge we face, and Nick touched on this earlier on, is obviously the impact of COVID. Compliance was all baselined against where we were in looking at the 2019 data. As you know, 2020, we'll all remember what traffic was like then. The level of NO2 fell by, I think, over 40% compared to the previous 3 years. Because of the disruption in traffic patterns, we are not able to use 2020 data to show whether local authority areas are in compliance. They may be in compliance in that year in particular, but it's about sustainability of the compliance position.
Whilst the NAO report does significantly acknowledge that COVID was a delaying factor, these problems were in train pre-COVID. So how can we be given an assurance from your answers that actually you're not going to continue to use COVID as an excuse, and you're actually going to get back to some real hard implementation?
No, sure. And look, I'd hope you wouldn't think that I was using COVID as an excuse rather than just an explanation of what was happening over this period. I mean, it's very hard to unpick the different impacts of designing. This is a complex, innovative programme, and I think the team's done amazing work in terms of how they've pushed forward this programme, and hopefully in partnership on the whole with local authorities. This involves behavioural science, environmental science, a new technology platform, partnership working, as I talked, but also doing it through a pandemic when everyone was working remotely. So this has been an incredibly hard programme to get right, and I think we've seen incredible progress over this period. Just to give a context of where the local authorities are on the sort of the pipeline from business case through, because I think this is important to giving you assurance on compliance. 14 have now completed all the measures that they said they would do. 12 of those took less than a year from the final business case through to full implementation. Fareham was delayed by a month or so. Nottingham was still working through some of the details with some of the taxi retrofit schemes. 17 that were identified by the NAO are still implementing. We've got dates for all of them, with the exception of Greater Manchester, which represents 10. In terms of timelines, the dates looking at 12 months from FBC through to implementation of all those. All of them are on track bar one, where Reading, I think, is a few weeks overdue due to issues with a retrofit contractor. And then of those that are yet to implement, and there are 7 identified in the NAO report, 2 have already now started. That's Tyneside, Newcastle Gateshead, Sheffield, Rotherham, we're expecting imminently, and we've got some complex issues with Liverpool, Stoke and Newcastle upon Lyme. On compliance overall, I hate to sort of say this, but we're going to be in a better place to tell you the answer in September when we're able to look at the 2021 data. On where we expect to be, I do emphasise the word expect to be, we're expecting 16 to be shown to be in compliance in 2021, and then a further 16 areas, this is of the 45, to be compliant over the subsequent 4 years. We're just working our way through the final 13, 10 of whom are GM, Liverpool, Coventry and Nottingham, and we're doing some further modelling to understand that. In terms of your question, and this is a really important question about the COVID versus other issues, and I think the NAO report was identifying that we were expecting at the start, we set ambitious timelines for, I think, 3 years for the overall period to be in the programme, and they set out, some of these have been up to 4.5 years. This is a sort of personal assessment rather than a sort of scientific unpicking of the data. But my personal judgment would be it's around 2/3, 1/3. So in other words, 1/3 of the delay has been due to the complexity of the programme, issues around the IT platform, 2/3 due to COVID. And I'll bring that to life with the example of Birmingham. Birmingham, as we were running into the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, we'd been working with them on the alpha phase of the technology build. We'd been working our way through what that meant in terms of the back office payments reconciliation, and they'd had some issues with, I think, some of their IT providers as well. At that point, they were originally looking to implement the Clean Air Zone in January 2020. I think in back end of 2019, they were pushed that back 6 months due to a range of issues. So I'd say that gives you 6 months rough delay. COVID then hit beginning of 2020, and that was then the introduction was pushed back 12 months. So again, not completely scientific, but I think that gives you a broad sense of the balance between COVID and non-COVID issues on this programme. But I think I'd just like to pay tribute both to team in JACU, but also the teams in local authorities that have been doing incredible work on this, I see, innovative, complex programme.
So, firstly, thank you for that very helpful, comprehensive answer. Mm-hmm. You do say you'll be in a better position to know precisely where you are with local authorities later in the year. Could you keep us updated by correspondence so that we know where we've got to with all of those local authorities?
And just to emphasise, that's not that we're not speaking to local authorities. This is on the compliance issue. In terms of the implementation of the measures, we are working hand in glove with local authorities on that as we speak.
So this committee knows better than any other. A lot of government projects have run into problems with systems in implementation. And perhaps one of the most difficult areas of the charging zone are the supporting digital system for charging, which was only communicated to local authorities 6 months before they would, or at least in one case, I think Leeds, 6 months before they were supposed to bring in a charging zone. Has that issue now been resolved, and do all the local authorities know exactly how they're supposed to implement this?
Yeah, this is an issue faced by Leeds, which were considering a clean air zone, and Birmingham back in 2018. The issue here was essentially would the provision of back office payment reconciliation services. And this is the challenge that the Wave 1 local authorities faced, is that we were learning and developing the project in line with government digital service guidelines in real time as they were developing it. We worked in partnership with them through 2018, 2019 to do the design phase. And David's already talked about the alpha phase, as it's known, looking at the free services, the vehicle checker service, the payments service, and then the reconciliation process. We then, on the basis of that alpha work, we decided not to offer the reconciliation service as part of that IT platform. The reason for that was this service, unlike what we'd seen in TfL, coming back to your earlier point about what we'd learned from London, TfL did offer that reconciliation service. That only had to plug into one authority. This would have to be a platform that would plug into multiple authorities, depending on how many clean air zones. And the judgment at the time in 2018-19 was that designing multiple reconciliation services would be less efficient if done centrally than done in the local authorities. Yes, it had an impact on timelines. There were other issues as well in terms of the IT delay, the issues at that point. But that was one of the issues. That is now a sort of standardised offer. And we worked our way through with that. And just to emphasise, as I think mentioned in the report, the IPA has recognised that this project's now been delivered to time, and GDS, the Government Digital Service, has said that all service criteria were met, and particularly praised the work through the pandemic to do a new innovative service in this way. But this is now a stable IT platform that local authorities know what they're designing into. And it's at the heart of it is trying to combine two things. One, the need for essentially local partnership or local shaping of the scheme. David has talked about the way in which Birmingham have different exemption criteria, different local authorities have different charging levels, but creating a common, essentially, payments engine which creates the economies of scale to do it in the most tax efficient way.
The answer for those eight authorities that are struggling with compliance is there are now proven technologies that will deal with their problems.
So in terms of the compliance will be a range of issues depending on the local authority. That may be just the nature of what is happening in the local authority on traffic patterns, fleet turnover and the like. But in terms of the clean air zone, there is no technical issue to implementation of a clean air zone. We've successfully launched 3 clean air zones over the last year and a half, more through the vehicle checking service. And in terms of sort of level of availability, we've checked over 50 million vehicles now. We've got 99.9% availability of the service. We're getting very good feedback from the customers.
Thank you very much. Ashley Richardson.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can we move on to public engagement on air quality? I think my first question is to Mr. Hill and Mr. Davies. Why did the government decide against a national campaign to raise public awareness on clean air zones?
Well, I think it relates to what Gareth was just saying about the importance of local decision making in relation to each area of the country. So we found that actually local places were best placed to judge how to communicate with their residents, and obviously different zones offer different features in different parts of the country. The exemptions in Birmingham are different to what measures might be put in place in Bath and so on. So that's why we felt it was right to provide some funding support, which we do, to local areas around their local comms and engagement, provide some support around evaluating their marketing campaigns, but not to seek to run a one-size-fits-all national campaign. That said, we have also, though at national level, worked intensively with, for example, industry bodies in the transport sector, hauliers and so on, to make sure that where national where sectors are operating across the country as a whole, that they have a good understanding of the programme across different parts of the UK.
So if you're relying on that to be done locally, have you made any assessment, or how are you able to make an assessment of the levels of awareness nationally of clean air zones?
So I guess we are funding and supporting evaluations in each authority with a clean air zone or group of authorities around the effectiveness and awareness of those. I think we took the judgment that that's the most important thing to focus on, as opposed to generic understanding in places that might have been nowhere near, hundreds of miles from a clean air zone. So that's why, with the resources available, we focused that on that local action.
Right, okay. Mr. Davies, did you want to...
Yeah, no, at the start of this programme, there's a choice between this essentially centrally driven, top-down, one-size-fits-all approach and the more locally driven. For the reasons we've touched on already in this committee, it's important that these programmes are locally designed and locally shaped, because they need to be part of their local transport plans, local regeneration programmes for the area. And in terms of the communication issues, I come back to the guidelines you get from Government Communications Service. And in terms of the professional guidance we have, it's about making sure that the communications is targeted, timely, relevant, and critically given by trusted intermediaries. And so the most effective communications, arguably, as we've seen through the pandemic as well, can often happen most locally. I mentioned I was in Birmingham recently looking at the implementation of their clean air zone. They were walking me through how they've used, for example, public health directors to explain the need for the clean air zone, a bit back to some of the earlier points around explaining not just the way in which the scheme will operate, but the why, so to create public acceptability and understand that it's not just another form of charging, but this is the importance for local health through the impact of NO2. Similarly, Birmingham has done interesting work around the way in which they provide online real-time data on air quality. So it's the importance of shaping the communications around the people who are going to need to use it and change the behaviour, because this is at our heart a behaviour change programme. And the risk is, if you have a national programme, will not be seen to be relevant, because if you're driving in, say, Liverpool, what Bath are deciding to do with their clean air zone is not really meaningful for you, and the risk is people switch off from the communications. We are evaluating it through. We are evaluating this through, as David said, our annual reports, which are looking at the way in which local residents understand the scheme. So if you look at the most recent report, which I think was published in March this year, in Bath, I think 25% of residents said they were changing their behaviour as a result of the clean air zone. 39% in Birmingham. So we're monitoring carefully the level of both understanding, but more importantly, the behaviour change we want to see to actually reduce NO2 levels.
Because that was going to be my next question, was just about public understanding and any confusion. You're then devolving that to the local authorities to clear up any confusion as well?
I think it's because the reason we're working with local authorities on this is we feel that local authorities are the best place to explain to their local residents the way in which the NO2 clean air zone will operate, the rules, the regulations, the charging and the exemptions behind it. And because each scheme will differ, because local authorities want to shape it for their own local context, a national programme would have to be so generic and bland it would not be relevant for people.
So how will you know if it's not working?
I think we'll know if it's not working for our annual evaluation reports. I say the most recent focused on Bath because we have 6 months of data. And it's early data, and so I wouldn't want to put too much weight on it, but that is showing both local residents changing behaviours in response to the introduction of the clean air zone. Also, and the data is, should we say, there's lots of noise in the data because of COVID and transport patterns. It's showing that NO2 levels per kilometre of journey in those clean air zones has fallen by about 10%. So that's the way in which we track it on an annual basis.
I wonder if I could just come in here. The success, if that's what it was, of the COVID communications programme was partially because of a strong national message. This was then backed up by local authorities and others giving details at a local level, which of course differed from area to area. Now, and the local authorities and others were very good at adapting to quite rapidly changing circumstances. What it seems to me here, reading this report, is that we are not getting a strong enough national message of what you're trying to achieve. And if you can't get the national message through, local authorities will struggle.
I think the distinction I would make is the need for strong national message around NO2 and clean air. And I think we've all shared the view that actually, whilst we're producing a lot of information, we're not bringing that together. It's a bit of frankly, it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle that you can put the pieces together, but we should make it easier for people. But I'd make that distinction with the clean air zones, which are local, specific, and are best communicated for the people who will be using those clean air zones in the local communities.
So what more can you do to strengthen the national message between you?
Well, perhaps I could address that, Chair, because I think one of the things we have committed to do on the back of the Coroner's Prevention of Future Deaths report following the tragic death of Ella Adu Kissy Deborah is to review all our sources of information around air quality, and we're taking expert advice on that review, including experts like Sir Stephen Holgate, but also behavioural scientists, health practitioners, and representatives of other community groups, and so we're looking across everything that's out there at the moment, because as Gareth says, there is a lot of information out there, but I think the NAO finding, which we take in the spirit that they've offered it, is that we can do better in terms of how we make that information accessible, and there are some quite significant things we need to work through there. So, for example, much of our current online offering is in English, so we need to think about how we have more targeted information for people whose first language may not be English. We need to think about older people who may have, for example, less access to smartphones and so on, and think about different ways of reaching older people, and also people with different health conditions, because the advice and the recommendations that we might make would need to be nuanced and targeted to different health conditions. So we're doing a lot now, and we spent over £9 million last year on public awareness. We fund an NGO called Global Action Plan to run the annual Clean Air Day, for example, which is a big awareness-raising exercise. But all of that work is being reviewed to see how we can improve on it in the future. I think the other thing I would just add is extending our reach into kind of the health practitioner community feels really important here. So we've just run some pilots where we've funded a pilot project working with around 40 GPs, and that's looking at whether we can make more of and support GPs in terms of the advice that they offer in their communities. So we've just run that pilot, and we'll be looking to see whether we can extend that further as part of this review. So I think the NAO's recommendations are helpful in this regard, and we'll be pursuing all of that work.
That's a great answer, Mr. Hill. But it sounds to me, and listening to everything that you've said this afternoon, there is an awful lot still to do if we're going to meet all our targets on all these pollutants by 2030. So how long is all this going to take to improve the message? Because unless you centrally can improve your message, I think the local authorities will struggle.
So, as I say, there's a lot out there right now. The UK Air website, which is our principal repository for all of our information.
Just stop you there.
Yes.
The UK Air website is relatively impenetrable. It's not great, and we looked at it this morning in preparation for this hearing. Is there any way you can make it work? As you say, it is your main source of communication, yet it's fairly impenetrable. How can we make it work better? How can you make it work better?
Well, so we're having a complete scrub of all of our web-based products to see if we can up our game on all of the social media and online offering as we take forward this review. We're looking to take forward that review over the next 18 months. The reason it's taking that length of time relates to the points I was making about making sure that the targeting is effective. We need to test whether the messages for some of those particular groups that I was talking about, older people, people from different ethnic minority communities, that we need to test that those messages are effective and are working, and that's the work we will go through. But we are seized with the urgency, and we want to push it forward as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Ms Richards, I'm sorry if I've stolen any of your thunder.
Chair, you haven't. Mr Hill cleverly anticipated my next questions on the coroner's report and,
read your mind.
And response. So I'm happy to hand over to Kate Green.
I just wanted to take a little further the Chair's question about the need for a strong national message. To what extent do you think that would be a response to the concern that local authorities have, that they are being held responsible by their residents for measures that are not popular and not wanted, and that national government is kind of walking away?
So I think I don't think national government can walk away. The legal obligation handed down by the court sits with national government, and I think national government has been very clear about its responsibilities in relation to the NO2 programme. I think my view on this is there's no sort of attempt to distance here. It's about ensuring that the message is tailored to local circumstances and delivered by local authorities who know their residents best. And certainly, if I think back to my time in local government before I joined DEFRA, where I was working for a county council, I think we would have looked a bit askance if national government had come along and told us how we were going to communicate with, in that instance, Essex residents. So I think that's the balance we're seeking to strike here.
People do move around, don't they? They don't spend all their time in their own local authority. So do you see scope for national messaging that really reinforces why these measures are needed?
Absolutely, we do. And that's why some of the work that I alluded to as we've developed the programme in terms of our engagement with hauliers associations, for example, who obviously move between different parts of the country, has been so important, so that there is, particularly with sectors that are directly affected, businesses that are directly affected, which have a national footprint, that we've worked quite intensively with those sectors to help them understand where there may be variations in different parts of the country.
And just one other question, if I may. You mentioned working with the health sector, which I think is very welcome. My own observation as a constituency MP is there's a huge amount of opportunity to work in education settings, and I just wonder what thought has been given to that.
Yeah, I think that is really important, and outside the parameters of the NO2 programme, but certainly some of the wider work my department leads around for example, the local air quality grants programme. One of the principal objectives of that grants programme is about providing support, for example, initiatives in schools. So a recent example, we funded through that works and worked with Tunbridge Wells and Canterbury City Council, for example. We're funding an animated storybook which is aimed at children and parents, helping them understand what they can do to reduce their exposure to air pollution, and that will be available to primary schools in those authorities, and we estimate will help families understand what action they can take. So the local air quality grants programme I think links back to your earlier question about do we need a sort of more holistic approach to air quality. It's very much designed to support local initiatives, whether that's education or health or support for local businesses, to take a whole range of action on air quality.
Thank you, Ms Green. Given that the NA report at paragraph 2.12 says that the Joint Committee estimate the overall model uncertainty remains at plus or minus 30%, as it was in 2017, how do you plan to evaluate the impact of the NO2 programme measures? Well,
that's the model which looks to predict the overall coverage of NO2 in the local. That's the national model of converting it down. You're right. There is a lot of there is still continued uncertainty at that level. That's why it's important to have the local assessment to complement what's happening at the national level, because it's so specific, the levels of exceedances. So there's two ways in which we look to tackle this. Firstly, and I can't remember off the top of my head the parameters by which we identify local authorities for participating in the programme, but we do ensure we include the variation and the margin of error when we identify local authorities. Apology, I can't remember the exact percentage now. So that makes sure we capture local authorities which, for whatever reason, might be seem to be above or below. Hence, once we have then captured the 64 local authorities, they then work through at a local level the modelling, and that's why we're able to say of the 64, well, 3 actually shouldn't have been part of the programme because of the nature of the particular stretches of road or schemes that meant they were outside. 16 of the 64 were actually found to be compliant because once we did the next level of assurance, they're able to be excluded, and we're able to work our way through. Similarly, we can work with local authorities to update the model and reopen the model. So, for example, I mentioned Southampton has reopened the model, and we are doing work with Sheffield and Rotherham as well on the nature of the model. Overall, the model is continually assessed through both our central analytical teams, both I think your chief analyst and mine, do an annual assessment of the review, and we have outside academics who look to assess the model. The model is never going to be perfect. I think we should recognise that. We're converting two networks which have, I think, the automatic network of 171 sites, the fusion tubes of 300 models, converting that into, as I said, a kilometre by kilometre grid of the whole country, including 9,000 sites on the strategic road network. We're also looking to forecast forward to make sure, because it's not just about this year, it's about future years as well. So it's never going to be a perfect model. We look to continue to update that. But we think the combination of both the local assurance, the academic assurance, and the way in which we use the parameters for identifying local authorities means we're able to tackle the concerns as identified.
I hear what you say about the local knowledge bolstering, if you like, the figures produced by the national model. But I'm not a statistician. But I would have thought a model that had an error rate of plus or minus 30% was pretty large.
That's a judgment call about where the error, how you interpret the error rates. This is a complex set of modelling. If you think the way in which Nick talked about the way in which NO2 levels can fall literally metre by metre. So if you are on one side of the pavement to the other, the NO2 levels will vary considerably. So if you can think about how then we're taking a national model and turning that into local data, you'd expect to have large areas of variation. So that's why I don't think it's just bolstering. It's the assurance process that happens at the local level to ensure the model is fit for purpose. And we're able to then the use of diffusion of those small diffusion tubes, which are actually only a couple of quid each for the actual tubes, it makes you able to actually then expand out the assessment at local level. When I say, just going back to the Birmingham example again, they are complementing the nationally provided through Davies department monitoring stations with their own as well to have more detailed understanding of what's happening locally.
Will the local authorities have more of these fusion testing kits than you do? So will they be dotting these around in many more places than you do is through the Highways Agency? It
will vary according to local authorities. So some local authorities will have a large number of these local modellings to understand the nature of the local persistence of NO2.
So is that data being relayed to your model in real time?
Yes,
so that
exactly.
you can know what's happening in the individual local areas.
Their local modelling then feeds back, and that's the assurance process I was just walking through to ensure that we're able to.
Okay, I'm beginning to get it now. So will that pick up if another area or another city suddenly emerged with really bad figures on these pollutants? Would that model pick that up?
Yes.
It would.
Yes.
That's interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. But of course, the background trend on NO2 is positive. I mean, I'm not dismissing the scale of the challenge we're facing here, but NO2 levels have been falling. They've fallen by about over 40% in the last decade. A lot of the trends are luckily in our favour. The shift to electric vehicles, for example, is all helping this in addition to the specific programme we're investigating today. So on the background, we are directionally heading in the right way.
Just one supplementary point, if I may, Chair, on this point is that we will also monitor through real-time data for 2 years after we think compliance is first achieved. So it has to be sustained compliance. So, and that's important, because of the sort of degree of local variation and so on that Gareth was describing. So we will be tracking, once a local authority hits where we think they need to be, they have to then maintain that for 2 years before we can declare that they're sort of through the programme.
And so typically, how long do you think, because it takes about 3 years to implement these clean air zones, typically how long are you envisaging that they would need to be in place before they hit that improvement that you're talking about and they're able to dismantle them?
An authority might hit compliance through a clean air zone within a 12-month period, and we anticipate that some of those already that have clean air zones in operation, when the September data comes through, we may find that actually compliance has already been achieved, but it will vary from authority to authority about whether measures in place need to remain in place, whether measures can be switched off, both charging and non-charging, but we will look for that sort of 2-year insurance period to ensure that the targets are, the improvements are real and some other factor isn't in play.
And the fact that the improvements are real, which is a really important point, is because of this behavioural change. People have bought electric cars or they're driving slower or whatever. So there's no possibility, once you've got that 2-year period, it isn't going to revert back to the old...
That's right. So the programme is the whole programme is predicated on accelerating what would happen anyway through, technological change over time and so on. It's a slightly misleading term, but you will see the term natural compliance. It's not really about natural in the sense of, what that means is, things that would happen absent action through the NO2 programme. So vehicle upgrades will happen over time and so on as people buy newer, cleaner models. Of course they will. But what the programme is trying to do is accelerate that. So as you say, if the programme is doing its job well, and all the evidence to date suggests we are seeing it having an impact, although it's early days from some of the clean air zones, then yes, those improvements should be locked in.
If I can bring that to life, part of the fund is obviously we naturally focus on the charging element of the clean air zones, but in parallel to that, there's also the Clean Air Fund, which is discussed in the report. There's over £280 million of funding, which essentially is funding things like retrofits for taxis, upgrades for the bus fleet. So if you look at what's happening in Nottingham, this is, as David was saying, accelerating the shift by essentially changing the bus network, so they're now moving to electric buses. That will have a permanent impact on local air quality.
And what are you doing about those local authorities that are not really actually drawing up a business plan? They're not really beginning to grip this problem. And how many of those are there?
So we're working closely with all of the local authorities. As I say, I don't think anyone is denying their responsibilities under the programme. There are lots of this is complex and controversial, as we've probably all touched on here. Greater Manchester, obviously, there are lots of complex issues that we're working our way through. Of the 7 yet to implement, probably the 2 most complex areas are Liverpool, where there's been a range of issues with both local contractors that locally have had to be replaced, but also some of the local politics has meant there's some issues around sort of the potential schemes that they're looking to promote. Similarly around Stoke and Newcastle upon Lyme as well. But we're working closely with them and we feel we're making good progress. But these are, I don't want to underestimate, especially on the larger schemes, these are complex issues that we need to work through. But overall, let's say, if we look at the overall portfolio of the local authorities, we're expecting 16 to be compliant, 21, then 16 more in the further 4 years. And the remaining ones where we don't have dates, I've touched on Liverpool and Greater Manchester, but the other 2 areas are essentially modelling issues, having to remodel on the basis of changed local travel patterns on the back of COVID.
Very helpful, thank you. And we've more or less exclusively discussed today NOx and particulates. Can you tell us whether you expect to meet the statutory targets by 2030 on all the other pollutants, sulfur dioxide. You mentioned methane, whatever they call themselves, high generation compounds, whatever they are. Can you just give us a rundown on all of those?
Yeah, sure. So as the projections we published last year would show that if we were to go forward to 2030 purely on the basis of existing policies and measures, and by that I mean regulations already in force, etc., so not policies that we've announced but not delivered, we wouldn't be on track for probably 4 out of 5 of those key pollutants. The one that I think we would be on track for is non-methane volatile organic compounds. Thank you for making me say it again.
You got it right, I couldn't.
That's the work we're seeking to address through the draft air pollution control plan, which we will publish for consultation shortly and aim to finalise for September. And the aim of that plan is to set out policies and measures necessary to bring us into compliance against all of the 5 key pollutants. So that's the piece of work that the committee will see coming in the coming weeks and months.
The one you haven't set out a target for is ammonia, and we know the reasons for that from agriculture. But is there a reason why you haven't set out a target for it?
There is a statutory ceiling for 2030 for ammonia. I think we're committed. I think the 2030 figure. So we're committed to reduce ammonia emissions from 2005 levels by 8% by 2020. So that's the one we've just missed. And by 16% by 2030. So there will be a statutory ceiling in 2030 for ammonia, and that's the work we're engaged on now, which is to identify additional policies and measures to get us into compliance for 2030. What we haven't done, if I've understood your question correctly, Chair, is there isn't a proposal for a specific longer-term ammonia target under the Environment Act framework. And as I said to Ms Richardson earlier, the reason we've sought to focus on air quality targets around PM2.5 in the first instance in terms of the Environment Act framework is really about the sort of the health risks that PM2.5 presents.
In a way, that sounds the most urgent one of the lot. I mean, Ms Richardson was giving you the health figures that your own, or the NHSA have come up with. I mean, that is a substantial number of deaths that could be avoided if we could reduce those particulates.
Yes.
Are you satisfied that you have an action plan? We've talked about various aspects of it today, in electric car charging, behavioural change and so on. Is there anything more? I mean, and looking at figure 4 on page 23, on the fine particulate matter, it looks as though the actual projection for 2030 are quite above the ceiling. Is there anything more that you can do to bring about quicker change in particulates?
I think we've sought to do a number of things in recent months to try and drive that change faster. So domestic burning, for example, people with wood burning stoves and so on in their own homes, that sort of thing, that actually accounts for about a quarter of PM2.5 emissions. And so the restrictions brought in on the sale of wet wood, the phasing out of house coal, traditional house coal for domestic use, those are some of the most important practical things we can do right now. That's on the statute, but that's in force. From January of this year, the new regulations came in under the Eco-Design Code for wood-burning stoves, for example, and those eco-design regs do include emissions reductions limits. So there's quite a lot of practical work being done right now, but I won't deny, to achieve those 2030 targets and indeed beyond, we will need to go further, and that's the purpose of the work we're doing through the draft air pollution control plan.
And I imagine that the particulates are going to be most dangerous in and around big cities, big centres of populations, whereas the wood-burning control regulations are largely going to affect the rural population.
So there are different, I'm sure you'll know, there are different legal regimes around focused action in what's called smoke control areas, typically in urban areas. So additional restrictions can be imposed in those areas, and clearly, as you're absolutely right, in rural areas where the impacts are less concentrated, some of those additional smoke control regimes don't apply. So we try and sort of target hotspots as they arise. The other thing that's quite important, and it touches on some of the questions Ms. Green was asking earlier around the importance of education and how we can educate people about and improve quality of our information about how people can manage their own exposure and manage down their own risk, and that's part of the work we're doing through that review of information output.
So the final question is, we don't want to get to 2030 and find that you've missed these targets. You're publishing a plan later this year. When and how will we see whether you are on track to meet those 2030 targets? What's the sort of trigger point, as it were? Talk us through that.
Yeah, so the work we're doing right now to scope what would go in the plan is about identifying policies and measures, but also through our models and through the national emissions inventory, sort of testing and calibrating how much abatement we think each measure will be able to deliver. So it's not simply publishing a list of policies, it is also trying to quantify what, on all our evidence, what we think the impact of those policies will be. So all of that will be laid out as we refresh the projections. How will we know if it's working? Well, we update our projections on an annual basis, and as policies are passed into law and are implemented, we will then adjust our projections, looking forward to 2030, on a rolling basis. So we will constantly be reassessing, have the things we've enacted and started to implement and fund, are they having the impact that we anticipate that they should? So you'll see those projections updated, and that's how we'll be able to track progress, and frankly how we'll understand whether we're on or off track.
Very helpful. Do you want to add anything, Mr. Davies?
No.
Well, can I thank our witnesses very much indeed. I think it's been a very interesting session. We've learned a lot. Can I thank my colleagues? Can I thank the NO and the Public Accounts team here in the House of Commons? It's all been, I'm sure, when our report will be published in the summer. Before the summer? Before the summer. In the summer, I'm told. And our uncorrected report transcript will be available in a couple of days' time, if you want to look at that and see if there's anything you need to look at. So thank you very much indeed. I know you're all busy people. We appreciate it hugely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.